Hi, everyone. I see a few people are joining right now. I'm going to wait a few minutes. I'm Mary Beth. I'm from the State Library. I'm going to wait a few minutes as we have folks join in, particularly since we had some latecomers sign up, and I just resent all of the info out. So the time is now 11:01. If you wanted to take a bathroom break or grab another cup of coffee, 11:05 is when we will start. I'm going to turn my screen off and hang out for a bit. All right. Actually, what I'm going to do is share my screen and start on the main PowerPoint slide. All right. So hang out for another 3.5 minutes and see you in a second. Some of you are just joining right now. We're giving folks a few more minutes to come on in. We will be starting at 11:05. So that's in 3 minutes. Hi there. It's Mary Beth from the California State Library. Thank you for everybody who is in the room. We're going to start in 2 minutes at 11:05. We're going to let more people join. All right, so hang out a second. Hi, for those who keep joining, I just wanted to let you know that we will be starting at 11:05. So in just under a minute. Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Beth Barber. I work for the California State Library. I welcome you all to the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program informational webinar. This is a session that goes over what the program is, as well as some key questions that have come up with this. I am the only one working on this webinar today. So if I become distracted, it is because I'm trying to make sure that newcomers are admitted into the room. One thing to keep in mind, I'm going to share my screen and so we can take a look at the slides. The best thing to do for questions is to definitely put them into the chat. which I will be keeping an eye on. This session is being recorded. So let me go ahead and move on to this. We're going to be going over today, first, the welcome that I'm doing right now. We are on Zoom during a regular meeting that is being recorded. So we'll do some recommendations for that. We'll talk about the California Civil Liberties program background and history, as well as what's new, because this is a program that existed before. Then we'll talk about applying for a grant and the important documents, eligibility and such, and review criteria, and then the new online, what is going on with the application itself. So, give me a second. I want to make sure I admit folks who are in the waiting room, and then we'll deal with questions. Now, looking at Zoom protocols, this is being recorded. So please keep your audio off unless you're asking a question, which I definitely encourage. It's probably best to keep, if you don't want your voice to be on the recording, then it's best to put the questions into the chat, and I will be utilizing that as much as possible as we go through this. You can also answer questions after this webinar by directly emailing civil.liberties@library.ca.gov. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program. It was created by law. So it's not a program that was created internally within a state agency, but it is a grant program that was established by legislation. This is the California Education Code section that specifically deals with what the law says and the reasons why it's there. Now, let's though talk about why then the purpose of this program exists. This slide deals with a bit of the history of what happened to the Japanese American community during World War II. Very specifically, the executive order that was signed 75 years ago that forcibly removed American citizens and their legal residents in the United States from their homes and forced them into concentration centers as part of the hysteria that happened, in the lead up to the lead up and onset of World War II. And of course, it wasn't a temporary thing. The folks who were moved from their homes spent years and lost quite a bit. All of these quotes that you see here are from an official congressional report from 1983 on what happened during the time. And this is the official description of the internment of civilians in the United States. So Congress, as well as California, realized that this was really a black mark on our history, that in the 1980s, Congress and President Reagan enacted a law to publicly apologize and make restitution to those who were interned. And they also, Congress, this was federally, created a public education fund. It was $5 million at the time for over 3 years. Well, that was back in the 80s, and a lot of folks in California took a look at that and were critical of that. Gee, the public education component was not enough. People still didn't know enough. So there was a bill that was introduced in 1998. That was the initial bill, and then it was continued with another bill that was passed and signed in 2000 that essentially established the California Civil Liberties Program as an ongoing program, but subject to budgetary constraints. And while that continued for a decade, in 2011, budgetary constraints did make the program go dormant for a short period of time. Assemblyman Phil Ting requested 1 million for the 2016-17 year. And then Governor Brown followed that up with a proposal the following year of 3 years of one-time funding. Now, when March of 2020 hit, they tightened up all of the budgetary things, expecting a huge hit to the California state budget. So that year, because of pandemic caution, was not funded. And then money was brought back. So in June of 2021, the budget that was signed by Governor Newsom had $5 million worth of funding over 3 years. So we've got programmatic cycles for this program of 2022 to 23, 23 to 24, and 24 to 25. This is a very dense slide, but this is essentially what it says in law, what the program does. By the way, all of these slides are going to be made available. In fact, they already are on the main Civil Liberties website. So you can go back and you can review and you can take a look at this. The language here from the law is also in the grant guidelines. And this is very important as you apply to be thinking about exactly what the law says. Let's go back a second. The applicant eligibility issue is a key question of what kind of projects and what kind of applicant would be eligible for this program. So applicants must be California-based nonprofit organizations or nonprofits that may have a national presence but have an office in California, and either that or a unit of California state or local government. You can have partners that work together, but the organization, there can only be one applicant. Fiscal agents are allowed, and for those of you who this may be a new term for, a fiscal sponsor or a fiscal agent is a nonprofit organization that principally works for oversight as well as accepting the funds as a nonprofit, but that the project itself is enacted with a different party, either an established organization or a loosely established organization that's brought together, say a series of freelancers that come together in order to fulfill the project. There can only be one applicant per round. So, one nonprofit that is applying as itself can only have one. If a nonprofit is acting as a fiscal sponsor for a number of different projects, that one can have multiple fiscally sponsored projects, if that makes sense. I see that I'm not going backwards in these slides. I will come back to these slides in a minute. What the law says and what the guidelines say, that all applicants must demonstrate the capacity to administer and complete the proposed project, meaning, does this team that is putting in an application, do they demonstrate that they can actually fulfill what they are proposing? The law says that they have to have the experience, knowledge, and qualifications to conduct successful educational activities regarding these issues. And so if you are doing something that's much more creative and an artistic style project, it's always good to be looking at advisors, either formal or informally, who are experts in this field, to be at least advising and being part of the project. And one key thing that the law says, that there must be information concerning the exclusion and detention of Japanese Americans during World War II. Now, that is nuanced, which we will address in a moment. All projects, so must deal with the civil liberty and justices. And that description is civil liberty and justices that are perpetuated on all of the different different groups here that you see. The projects must include the Japanese American experience in some way. That's not to say that the projects are only concerning the Japanese American experience during World War II. They just need to include it so that there is a public understanding of what happened to the Japanese American population during World War II. All projects have to have a public education impact. They need to add on. So doing the same thing over and over to the same educating the same population with the same information is not the purpose of this program. It is to make more Californians aware and really thinking about these issues. It does say in the law that there needs to be a variety of different aspects of looking at this. And it's interesting, the law gives examples. That doesn't mean that they're the end all. It's just the law does give very specific examples of what kinds of variety of viewpoints should be looked at, and definitely needs to expand the public awareness, meaning that a project that is created but does not get viewed by a large number of Californians, you have to think about, is that really expanding the public awareness in California? Because that's the purpose of the project. It's not an artistic investment, so to speak. Some of the changes now that are, because we have more funds, we have two main changes. One, the maximum requests in these two main categories is more. So this year it is $125,000 for statewide or highly impactful education, preservation, public media, or museum projects. And museum is an added category here. And then community projects, and that's a catch-all for a lot of different types of projects. The maximum request is $50,000. In terms of looking at the different categories of projects, education has some very specific language, and you can read this in the guidelines about what needs to happen. An education project really needs to be integrated into, you know, a large number of students learning. This is not a build it and they will come type of situation. It's for large scale and, you know, complicated or comprehensive education projects that have a statewide impact. You can have smaller education projects, such as working with one school or one particular classroom. Those are more community projects, though. For preservation projects, the description, and this is again coming straight from the guidelines, can deal with all of these particular issues. Now, keeping in mind, you know, these are for really large scale preservation projects. If there is something that's more small or localized, that's where you may want to consider taking a look at the community project category. For public media, again, public media is about outreach to a large swath of the population. And these are the different types of applicants who would be eligible: nonprofit media organizations, media production houses, particularly if they're nonprofit or if they're working with a fiscal sponsor, and then also units of government that have a public media function. And then all of the projects should have these elements to it: dealing with the Japanese American experience, potentially dealing with others' experience, directly affect Californians, that they create discussion and foster community dialogue and engagement, and then that they promote civic engagement. And again, just like was said for preservation and for education. These are for very large projects. If you have a smaller project that might be a public media project, still consider going into the community projects category. Museums one is new. Now there are multiple slides here for all you museum folks, because there are a lot of different aspects of the projects that should be part of any comprehensive museum project. So these are the general guidelines that look familiar, some of the same ones that are from the other components. And then these are some of the more specific components that you foster the community dialogue, both through the physical displays and such, but also, you know, building educational materials, encouraging this kind of civic engagement, bringing in other groups. When you have the educational materials really working to understand what the teachers and the educators in the K-12 environment need in order to incorporate it into the classroom in a number of different subjects. For college level, you know, they need to be academically rigorous. Truth of the matter is everything needs to be academically rigorous in the sense of being honest and true. That's where your experts come in. Obviously for younger students, it's not that it's complicated work, but rather that it is based in something that has been vetted by experts. And then ideally museum projects would have online educational components. Ones that understand and work within the student data privacy laws, but that can also be utilized by students and educators, that there wouldn't be barriers to access. Barriers of access is, that is a big component of any of the museum projects that would be funded for this, that there needs to be activities for members of the public that, you know, these are the different types of displays that could be a component of it. It could include some preservation components as well, but that all of these things need to be accessible, both the program, individuals with disabilities, individuals who may speak languages other than English. Low-income California residents must have an easy access method in order to partake in any museum project. And then there needs to be outreach efforts in order to gain new audiences. And then of course, everything must be physically located within California, as well as, and this goes for all projects, keeping in mind COVID protocols and what's going on with your local public health jurisdiction. When we get done explaining community projects, I'm going to take a breather from this and answer any questions before we get into the evaluation components. So community projects, these can vary all over the place. We've had films and books, photo collections, visual art exhibits, as I said, museum displays, although some of those may be now eligible in the larger category if it's comprehensive. Lots of visual arts, oral histories, the documentation and preservation of materials, education guides, website tools, literature arts projects, public art projects, music. There's been a lot of different ones that can fit into this category. The things that absolutely need to happen though is that this is California state money. So these feature Californians and California groups that were impacted and are impacted by civil liberty and civil liberty violations. That there's community participation and community discussion, constructive community discussion. As we all know, there can be lots of discussion that's not productive for engaging in civic engagement and you know, positively, in a positive manner, fostering that. So that is one component that must be there. There must be a Japanese-American connection, and the public needs to be able to access these different projects. Quick reminder of what cannot be funded. We don't fund grant writing or fundraising activities as part of that. If they're not in compliance with other California state library grants, then that may be a problem. We did get some questions of folks that are finishing up previous projects. Are they eligible for new projects? And the answer is yes. Particularly, there's been a lot of COVID timeline extensions, which is perfectly fine. I'm going to take a quick question that came in from the chat, and there are some universities that could be in the state. And yes, we did have some Cal State awards. We have actually funded a UC before, and that could be in any of these categories. The university level folks have been funded for preservation projects. Some we have funded education projects. In fact, at one point we had a one of the universities, and I don't remember which one, but they funded an educational technology project with Minecraft, which was pretty exciting and interesting, a really interesting take at getting the education in aspects out there. So universities can participate across the board in any of these types of categories. And if you've got a university museum, that can work too. So back to what cannot be funded. We don't fund the federal government. We don't fund for-profit organizations as applicants. You need to work with a fiscal sponsor in that case. We don't fund programs that the public can access. That is not the purpose of it. It is really to make sure that the California public can access these materials and programs. We do not fund projects that promote a very particular political, religious, or ideological point of view. In terms of indirect overhead, our max is 5% on that. Now, administration that deals directly with the implementation of a project, that's not indirect overhead. That's a direct cost. And you should definitely note administrative costs associated with that. But indirect overhead, 5% is your cap. We don't fund cash reserves or endowment funds. We don't fund the purchase of, when we say equipment, we're talking about large scale equipment, like big, huge things like an entire, say, goodness, I don't know, a theater's HVAC unit. No, we wouldn't do that kind of thing. That's not the purpose of this program. Ditto when it comes to land, buildings, or construction. Out-of-state activities, there's a lot of folks, because obviously the Japanese American experience and civil liberty violations happened nationally and had a multi-state impact, but it's state funds and it's a little tighter on that, which means that out-of-state activities are not funded by this program. It's California money to benefit Californians. And then hospitality and food costs. Everybody wants to throw a welcome cocktail or a welcome kind of event like that, unless it is actually dealing with, say, travel costs. That kind of food expense is not allowed with these funds. That's not to say that you can't find somebody else to sponsor that as part of the overall project. Just please don't expect to be able to use the civil liberty funds to directly pay for something like that. And then there's the issue of expenses that were incurred before or after the grant period. I'm going to take a look at the chat real quick. And school districts. Can school districts apply? Yes, they can. They are considered local government in that case. There's a very specific question about a Day of Remembrance series of programs. If it is a new set of programs, maybe the same theme, but there's a new set of programs, there's not really a waiting period. It's the type of thing, let me put a caveat to that. We have COVID issues, right? Everybody was stalled on some of the programming. If a program was funded and then was delayed and will now be implemented now or in the near future, and you got funds for that program before, you can't apply again to Civil Liberties for the same programming because you've already received it for that. If that program is done and this is new and you're adding a new aspect to it, bringing in a new community, creating a new partnership, something that is new and different, that would be eligible for a new request. Out-of-state participants on the grant. So that again, this is a tricky question. Here's what I've seen. Can you bring in an out-of-state expert or worker or somebody to fulfill a component of it? Yes. Can you pay for them to travel? Well, the state rules on travel are so specific that no, you'd have to find some other way to fund that component. If there are very specific aspects like that, describe it in the proposal. And what we have done in the past is gone through line item by line item to say, hey, we're going to fund you, but you cannot use the funds for this part of the budget that we see that you have there. If that makes sense. Sorry, I'm reading one of the questions here. So if somebody is looking for a fiscal sponsor and the nonprofits that you're normally familiar with don't do fiscal sponsorship, my best suggestion would be to ask for advice on who to reach out to who could. In terms of, this is just general advice, if you're looking or seeking a fiscal sponsor, most of the time your local arts agencies are going to be familiar with different organizations that do fiscal sponsorship. So that would be one potential area or arena to ask. And check in with your community foundations as well. Oftentimes, if they don't know a local organization that can help with that, they would do that. We don't make any direct recommendations for any particular fiscal sponsor. With that one, that's going to be part of your homework. And I hope that answers all of that. I'm glad I'm able to see the chat. Going to continue on. Whoops, one more chat. Let me see. Okay. All right. What everybody wants to know about is the evaluation. Like, how are these evaluated? One thing that I did not go into detail is the fact that we have a legislatively and gubernatorially appointed advisory committee. These are folks that are appointed by legislators and by the governor's office in order to review all of the applications and make advice to the state librarian about what would be fundable. Now, in the advisory committee, we've got a 100-point ranking system, and there are some very specific categories that the advisory committee is asked to look at. And in terms of the infrastructure, just so everybody knows and understands, there's 4 main criteria. There's 5 questions within those criteria, and each question is worth 5 points. And that gives you 100. So you can do a 100-point ranking. Now, the ranking that's done ahead of time is not the final. There is a discussion that happens between the advisory committee members and the state librarian. And then from there, the state library will put forth the funded projects. Now, first review criteria is the the quality and the appropriateness of the project. This deals very specifically with the components that we look at in the law. Does it fit the main purpose of the program? Is there an impact for Californians? Does the team that is proposed have the expertise to specifically address the purpose of the Civil Liberties Program? Is there open access? And then is there a future benefit? Meaning, is this going to have a really, really small life, or is there the ability to come back to what's created in order to further the purpose of the program? And if you notice, there are 5 bullets there. There are 5 questions that deal exactly with that. The next big category is the relevance. Is this project relevant for wide audiences? Is it unique? And is there a connection to civil liberties today? The program was established very purposefully to prevent anything like this from happening again. In order to do that, people need to know and talk about it. It needs to not just apply to a small subset or be encouraging the dialogue and understanding through only one lens or one way. And is there a connection today? So in terms of that, we take a look at, are the projects in a geographic area that's dispersed throughout the state so that there is wide knowledge everywhere? Is this, what is the audience? Is this a new audience that maybe, or a wide audience that will be influenced and partake and be educated by the project, or is it a small subset? The subject matter itself, is it something that is relevant, or is it too small of a subject matter to have a wide influence? Is the engagement method of the public or the preservation method, well, let's talk about engagement. Is the engagement method something that would have an impact on the audience in a way that would be meaningful and have lasting understanding of the civil liberty violations from the past and how to prevent them in the future? If we're dealing with preservation method, is the preservation method of what's being preserved something that can be used in the future, or is cataloged in the right way so that there is a method to continue the preservation and the use of the preservation materials in the future? That is key, because to simply preserve without it having potential to be used by wide audiences, that has a limitation. And then, is there an urgency for it? We're definitely looking at that when it comes to the relevance of the project. And then the impact itself. The impact would be the size of the outreach, and the whether or not there's positive community dialogue that happens. So you can have it mentioned to a lot of people. Do they really think about the impacts? Do you have community dialogue where there is real deep discussion about these issues and understanding of these issues? Is there public interest in participating in the project as well as the subject matter? Does it have an impact on the new audiences that may or may not have been exposed to this before? And then, does it have lasting potential? And then finally, we take a look at the nuts and bolts of project management. Are there realistic outcomes? Is there a realistic budget? Is the organization who is putting it together, do they have the strength to fulfill a project like this? Is there an appropriate timeline? And then do the personnel have the skill and expertise to fulfill? All of those will be answered in the application. So some important dates today, the informational webinar. The deadline is a month and a day from now on April 25th. At some point in early May, the advisory panel will review, and then in June, we'll have funding notifications for the first round. There will be, even though it's one-time funding, it's one-time funding of 5 million over 3 years. So the expectation is 1/3 of the 5 million each year. And then for this round, the funded activity period will be from the minute the grant agreement is signed until June 30th of 2023. I see a question. Regranting. So the question is, do you allow sub awards, which sounds like the concept of regranting. Right now, we don't have that capacity for this project. The program is established for project-based grants. So the answer right now is no. I will look into that to see if there's another approach to take. So it sounds like somebody is in the always fun process of establishing a nonprofit. And yes, we do need to have, when you apply, you do need, if you have an FEIN number, definitely take a look at that. In terms of if you are in the process of establishing a nonprofit, it's going to depend on where you are. And by the time we get the grant award out, you'd have to be an established nonprofit. If you're willing to run that risk, that is your choice. However, my advice would be to definitely look for a fiscal sponsor in that case. The next question that I see here was, could you have a fiscal sponsor as a backup? When you apply, you need to have it set. So determining which direction you go with a fiscal sponsor or with an independent nonprofit, you need to apply that way. That said, I have processed previously an organization that applied with a fiscal sponsor. In the meantime, got their final paperwork done. And that means for the whole gamut. There's not only getting the nonprofit status from the IRS, but you also have to make sure that you have it for Franchise Tax Board, for the Secretary of State, for DOJ, and all of that done. But if you have all of that done after you apply and the fiscal sponsor is fine with a switch, I admit I have processed that before. So if that were to happen, apply as a fiscal sponsor, and then we'll see if we can do a switch. Otherwise, you should go through the fiscal sponsor. And thank you, Kate, for the information about Fractured Atlas. I have heard of them. I do not know anything about them, but that is something to take a look into. And that only works, I believe, if Fractured Atlas has a California connection of some kind. That is one thing to keep in mind, that if you're working through a national nonprofit as a fiscal sponsor that has no satellite office in California, they're technically not, they're not eligible, and a different fiscal sponsor should be examined. So then the question is even if the person and the project is going to be 100% in California, we would need to review that. Again, because it's state funds, that can be a little bit more complicated, and the advice would be it's always best to be working with a California nonprofit. So I'll wait for a few seconds to see if there's any new chatting going on. Okay, the online application. Previously, for folks who have applied before, you learned the submittable application interface. That was what we were using before. We are in the process of launching a new grant management system. The grant management system is from WiseHive, and we're still we're still doing the final tests to make sure that it works. I'll be doing that the rest of this week and early next week. All applicants will have at least 3 weeks in order to put all of the information into the grant management system. I apologize that it's not 100% ready to go. We will have at least 3 weeks for you though. If you would like to know very specifically the questions that will be asked, I can definitely supply that. So go ahead and email sybil.liberties@library.ca.gov if it's like, yes, please give me the questions. I may even be posting them on the website as well if I get lots of requests like that. If you take a look at what we talked about, the fact that every project will have a project description, a timeline, a budget, and we have budget templates that you can use that have 3 sheets in them. The budget templates that we created include not only how the civil liberties funds would be used, but if you have civil liberties funds as part of a larger project, you have a template that you can use for how you describe the whole project and then what kind of income you may have for a larger project. Or you can just use the one sheet of how the civil liberties funds will be used, but you have a template in Excel that's available on the website. We need to know about the project personnel. And then meaning who is going to be the experts, what's the strength of the organization? That's the information that would be there. And then, goodness, what did I go over? And then anything else that you would want to add. You'll have, once it's up, you'll have the save draft functionality. And this goes over the rest, the key personnel, and then any supplementary materials. You take a look at the next question. Multi-year project. That's a very good question. If you have a multi-year project, something that's really big and needs to be taken into chunks, then yes, you can apply for a different aspect of it. So when you apply now, if you are just launching it, you need to be very specific about what the parameters of this level are. That way, when you reapply, it doesn't look like you're reapplying for the same thing again. That is a question that we have had before. And yes, we have funded multi-level projects, because there are some projects that take 5 years to implement. And as long as what you're applying for is very specific to a component of it, I will say that given the purpose of the program, which is to reach as many Californians as possible, to have them have as a deep understanding of civil liberties issues as possible, particularly the Japanese American experience during World War II, that if you're applying just on the first level, it will behoove you to include plans that would include eventual outreach and distribution, so to speak, of the final implementation. That applying only for, say, the creation of something, I'm particularly thinking of, for example, documentaries. If there is no, and here's the infrastructure, you have to take a look, does it fit all the criteria that all of the projects are being evaluated on? One moment, my system is slow. So inside the application, you're going to have your basic information that you're going to be putting in. Now, if you're working through a fiscal sponsor, it's always best to have the project title. If your nonprofit has a name, and please make sure that the official name is in the field that says official name, so that, and then add your nickname or common name or DBA name in a different section. And I say that simply because doing the paperwork at the end needs the actual name that's on your 501c3 information. And if you don't know it from your fiscal sponsor, make sure you get the official name of the applicant information. You'll be choosing and just pointing out where you are located in the state, including because this the legislature was so deeply involved in the creation of this program, we do like to note the Assembly, the state Senate, and the congressional districts. In the online application, you'll be talking about your project. You'll be talking about which category, you'll be choosing these when you go through. You'll create a brief description of the project. And that brief description, by the way, it's pretty short, but it's the idea of give a really small blurb that can be used in a press release. That's how to think of the brief description of the project. You'll give a detailed description of the project. And then you'll answer specific questions that deal with the project category. So education will have a different question I think it's a pair of questions, than preservation, public media. I should have added museums in here, and community projects. You'll create a timeline. It's a pretty simple grid. We do have a template for that. And keeping in mind that it's not that I wrote project starts in the summer of 2022. The funds from the Civil Liberties program would be spent starting in the summer 2022. So if you've already started a project that's been funded elsewhere, or it's pro bono labor, then it's a question of, you can't backfill with these funds, but you can go forward with them. So note to self, I will adjust that language, because the project can start, you just can't spend the funding before you actually have the funds in hand. Ideally, the project conclusion would be no later than June 30th of 2023. I will tell you, COVID created a lot of extensions, and we do extensions. I think, though, that unless we have some more public health or other emergency related issues, we will be looking for projects that do conclude on time. We won't be we'll still honor any requests for timelines as long as they're reasonable. And then like I said, we provide a simple table in Excel for the timeline application. The budget, again, take a look at the template that we've created, but components of a budget will typically include services, materials, labor costs, different travel. You can have in-kind contributions, and that can include, labor in kind. You should review what can and cannot be funded with Civil Liberties. There is a good list in the guidelines. And then, keep in mind the difference between administrative costs and general overhead, and no more than 5% general overhead. There is not a matching funds requirement. It is recommended, and volunteer labor definitely can be a matching fund component, but it is not required for this program. And then you'll be explaining applicant information, your organization, the mission, the goals. If you're working through a fiscal sponsor, a brief description of the fiscal sponsor is fine. And then, talk about the goals, or, your own, the program team talking about the purpose and any other overview information. Some description of the key personnel. Ideally, it would be great in narrative format, because then that's easier for us to, from a publicity standpoint, be talking about the experts who are part of this program. You can still, that's why I put ideally, not a resume or a CV that's just a list, or you can do both. In fact, both would be probably the best. And those can be attachments that are put in if you need to not just have it be narrative. So if you have an informal group of film producers, in this case, or any other folks who will be doing this, the individuals, listing the individuals and their expertise are fine. So brief description of the fiscal sponsor, so that there's an understanding that, yeah, they've done this type of thing before. And then a description of who the key personnel are is fine. And then you can add in other supplementary materials. That can include samples of past projects, any additional information, anything that you'd want to add that you think would be helpful. And we do have a number of different formats that we can accept. We can definitely take a look at any letters of recommendation that you would want to put in the supplementary materials. Absolutely. So these are some of the main questions. Do you accept fiscally sponsored applicants? And yes. And if you need to know if this is a new concept, this is a definition from the National Council on Nonprofits that was put up, and you can find out more information about that. And again, talking to folks in the arts field is always a good idea because they have, this is something that is often well known within the arts field. This is the tricky question we always get. What do you do with projects that are centered around civil liberty violations? In fact, that are absolutely under most people's definition of civil liberty violations, but are not directly related to the Japanese American experience during World War II. This is exactly what it says in the law, which means that any project that is funded by this must fulfill these components. And as you can see in number 2 here, there's a wide number of topics, but that doesn't mean that number 1 has no place for it. Now, if you are dealing, and that then you can do and draw direct comparisons for any kind of education project, community project, museum, etc. We do get questions, but wait, what about preservation? How does that work? I don't have a clear answer for that type of scenario. However, if the description of the materials that are being proposed to be preserved have a direct connection or parallel and can be utilized in an education context for the purpose of this program, you're certainly eligible as a project or as an organization. How that is evaluated is a question that is determined by the advisory committee. And I would encourage any organization to really look at this slide and think about the answers that are being provided as part of the project proposal. I'll take a look at some of the questions. Oh, funding for the program. When somebody is a grantee, we do it in 2 chunks. 80% comes right after you fill out all of the grant paperwork. And then the last 20% is after the final report has been approved. There is a mid-grant check-in report that's not tied to funding that happens in around January, just to see how everything is going. So we had a question, is it possible to submit more than 1 application? So a fiscal sponsor can, and if the fiscal sponsor has more than 1 application, we have funded more than 1 that came from the fiscal sponsor. The nonprofit itself, whether it's a museum, etc., you can only have 1. So if I'm going to give a hypothetical. If you've got a theater company and you are putting in for either 1 performance or a series of performances, and then you turn around and also apply for a school tour as a separate project, no, we'd have to pick or choose. I would, it's one project. Now, you can take, if you're taking a look at a comprehensive education project, for example, or if you're a museum and you're taking a look at a series of exhibits, then you can definitely do that. That would be one grandiose project. And it is still the max per category, either 50K for community projects and 125 for education projects. Sorry, I'm moving on to the next frequently asked question. How do I know? How do I know if I'm in the big category or the small category? It goes back to that language that is in the guidelines, that the large category is for something that's really, really big and, you know, multi-step, or that's really going to reach a wide audience. We obviously want to make sure there's opportunity for localized projects, and that's what community projects are going to be about. I will say that in the past, we have had folks apply in the large category who have been funded in the community project category because the description of their project fit that. It would behoove, though, anybody who's applying to be very realistic about their project. Because if you try to bite off too much, that will influence one component of the evaluation, which is this entire project realistic? And you know, overreaching in the hopes of getting the big money can influence that. So it's just, when you're applying, think about these things. This goes back to, we get this question all the time, will it be exactly what's requested? And not necessarily. There may be a different level. There may be components that are recommended to be funded and others that aren't. We have taken that, somebody may have tried the large category and got funded in the small, that sort of thing. And in the guidelines, it very specifically deals with that. If you do need to adjust the budget because the amount comes in that's less than, or there's less programming based off of a smaller budget, then that is something that is negotiated before the, and cleared up in terms of defined before the grant agreement goes out. Matching funds required? Nope, they are not required. They are looked upon favorably. And then if there's any other questions. So the question is, if there is a project that deals with the Japanese American community, but not dealing specifically with the incarceration component of World War II, we'll keep in mind what happened during World War II and the civil liberty violations that were rooted in, let's face it, racism and other issues. That if it starts to answer those kind of questions of why in the world did this happen in 1941 and 42 through 45, that would be an eligible project. And, you know, if the project principally deals with the Japanese American experience, bringing in others who are dealing or who have been, are experts in either past or present types of situations that parallel that, is a great way to create the community dialogue. I mean, one thing I really want to emphasize is which project's going to be looked upon more favorably. A project that goes really, really deep, but to a very well-educated audience that knows these issues incredibly well, or one that takes those experts and those individuals who know this and broadens the outreach to new audiences that are unaware and that would benefit from these discussions. The purpose of the program is public education of all of California. So that's something that an applicant should be thinking about. I'm going to stop sharing right now and see if there are, oh, is there a recommended limit for administrative costs? The only requirement is no more than 5% of general overhead. In terms of the amount of administrative costs that there are with the project, justify it in the description of the project of what that administrative component would be doing. It really is by project because every project is going to be different. So no, we don't put those kind of caveats on. Do we have more questions? We're 6 minutes over, so I'll wait for another. Actually, we started at 5 after, so we are 1 minute over. So I'll wait for, see if anybody else has anything. Not seeing anybody else putting anything in the chat. Well, okay, I'm gonna wait. We have one more. And while we're waiting, I just want to thank everybody for your interest. This is a program that is very near and dear to the State Library. It's been at the State Library since its inception in California, and lots of really good projects have come. In fact, you can check out some of the projects that have been funded in the past. We do have a list of more recent projects. It's in a Google form that's on there. Don't go yet. There's one more question that somebody else was typing in. And so the question is if the project has multiple parts, do we have to reapply for part 2 and part 3? The answer is yes. We will still need to see where everything is at. And you know, do you have to use all of the funds within 1 year? If you don't, then you need to put an extension in for it, which is why if you have a multi-year project, take it in chunks and apply for the chunk that you can finish within the year that you're applying for. And some folks, we owe you money. I am working through the process, and yes, we need to get checks out for you, and we are working on that right now. I personally apologize. We have been short-staffed, and you know, no more excuses. I will get that out for you. Oh, one more thing for everybody who knows this project. We will have a full-time staffer eventually on this. They have moved me over into a different job, and there will be a full-time person dedicated to civil liberties, which is new. This before was lumped in with a lot of other things. So thank you for your understanding about me being late on getting all the paperwork processed. And then is it possible for, I think I saw one more question, can a nonprofit put in more than one proposal? And again, for the following year, yes, but for nonprofits, it really should be 1 per year. If you wanted to try to put in more than 1 proposal and only have 1 of them funded, then you can do that. If it's the type of thing, I don't want to go with this one yet. If you have projects that are connected and a series of projects that are preservation, education, museum, or public media related, then propose those as a series as 1 big package for the big money. If they are community projects that do that, you know, it's really just 1. Any more? All right, please feel free to email civil.liberties@library.ca.gov. You can email me directly in the short term as well, marybeth.barber@library.ca.gov. And thank you very much for participating today.